Hello, I'm Natalie Kenway, Global Head of ESG Insight at ESG Clarity, and welcome to this very special video interview. So today I'm speaking to Steve Waygood, who is Chief Responsible Investment Officer at Aviva Investors. Thanks so much for your time today, Steve.
My pleasure.
So I wanted to ask you some questions around the upcoming COP27 in November. So first of all, what are your expectations or what's on your wish list from COP27?
God, the wish list, wow. Well, I wish it was a lot better at managing climate change. I mean, honestly, if you look back, humanity has known for over 1,000 years that the climate has changed over history. We've known since roughly 1880 that burning coal, causes the climate that we're in to change. And I remember when Jim Hansen was addressing Congress, and since those days in the 70s and 80s, where we've known that climate change has been an issue, and we enshrined the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. It's called COP27 for a reason, isn't it? It's the 27th time we've all come together. So for a long-term investor, looking at the physical risks, where the science has now got so much clearer, that these physical risks of even 1.5 degrees, but 2, 2.5, 3, 3.5, they're really unconscionable. Right? For those of us who work in the ESG industry and know what the science is now telling us, we're worried that the current trajectory of climate change means potentially the collapse of civilization as we know it by the end of the century. So this is huge. This is huge. And then you look at even the progress that was made at Glasgow, where there was relatively good progress relative to what other COPs have done. And then you look at the scale of that crisis and ask yourself, is it enough? And unfortunately, Natalie, the blunt, honest reality, free from any kind of politics, is it's nowhere near enough. So I think long-term investors worried about the existential crisis that the physical risk of climate change presents will be disappointed almost with the best outcome possible of COP27. So we have to ask ourselves, what more can we do as investors to shift the political dial so that we get what we need out of this process that has to be made to work? There's nothing else.
Now, how can we build on that progress that you mentioned that was made at COP26, and what are the key things to be looking out for this year?
Well, one of the key things to look out for, which is downside risk, is there's an enormous conversation expected around loss and damage. There's another way of thinking of that in non-UN language is reparations to those countries that have experienced huge damage and therefore economic loss over the last, say, few hundred years. And just look at, for example, what's going on in Pakistan at the moment with the flooding. Bloomberg estimates that the cost of that are over 30 billion. So loss and damage, given that it's hosted now in Africa rather than the UK, we can expect the developing countries, not just of Africa, but particularly there, to come together to say, we need more by way of loss and damage reparations. And even the 100 billion that was agreed in Copenhagen, that's still not flowing at the scale that the commitment was promised. Nearly made it last year for COP, very close. But the OECD estimates still find that there's a roughly 20 billion shortfall on the year. So I guess we need to ask ourselves, as I said, how can we change that? What can we as private sector financial institutions who are really exposed to this coming financial crisis from climate change, what can we do to encourage those politicians that want to do more to be able to do it and change the needle in those countries where they haven't quite yet cottoned on to the fact that this stuff is existential? So it's big. So I've been going to COP since COP6. I haven't gone to all of them, but you go full of optimism. And then when you're there, it's sometimes awe-inspiring at just how much is done by so many tens of thousands of people really committed. But you always leave with a sense of things having been left on the table unresolved and the whole thing not adding up to enough. And that's a kind of global governance failure. And I think we need to come up with solutions to that urgently. We have, it is said, less than 10 years to change the trajectory of economic growth. And the COPs aren't enough for that at the moment. We need to be honest about that. The politicians tend not to be quite so blunt.
So yeah, it's really interesting to get your perspective, especially when you've been going since COP6. We really don't want anything else to be left on the table, but with the current macroeconomic environment, there's this consideration that there's less focus on tackling climate change. When people are talking about tackling climate change and the cost of living crisis, they could be done together, but that's really not happening, is it? So what's your perspectives on that? Do you think that there's less focus on climate change now in this difficult environment?
There's a real contradiction within this. There's the opportunity to build back better, as we already have had, and people have been using that phrase, haven't they, from COVID. And I think it depends on how the country responds. I mean, that's so obvious as to be utterly glib. But if you look at the response, we weren't expecting the US to be able to pass the Build Back Better Act, rebranded as it was the Inflation Reduction Act. It came through. It was a very clever piece of branding, and amazing to see that come through at the very last hour. You're right, this is deeply difficult. And one of the things that I've learned from the Russia-Ukraine situation, I realized, having worked for nearly 30 years in this area, I feel confident that listed businesses have a trajectory for change, a transition that we can encourage as investors them to take. Even some of the state-owned enterprises in Russia and in Saudi Arabia and in Brazil, they're exposed to more pressure from investors to transition. And I know that the sovereign wealth funds out there get the fact that they need to diversify their income. So I could see a plan forwards that was plausible, but having now realized that many developing countries, and in fact many developed ones too, they see the oil and gas revenue as the way that they protect their nation. It finances their defense system. Now that changes the texture of the challenge, or the just transition challenge, in many ways, and it's extremely worrying. So what do we have to do as investors? I think we need to recognize that micro stewardship, engaging with individual companies, is never going to be enough. It doesn't change the profit motive. It doesn't change the fundamentals of the companies we're engaging with one iota. You're simply encouraging companies to do the right thing, either morally or maybe because there's a business case for them to be more eco-efficient. But for as long as it pays to dig it out of the ground and burn it, someone somewhere is going to do that. So I think as investors, long-term investors, asset owners and asset managers, we need to come together and challenge the central banks and the finance ministries of the countries that we lend money to, which, let's be honest, is pretty much all of them. We need to challenge them to grab the nettle on climate change and make it pay companies to do the right thing and cost to do the wrong thing. We need to change the economics. We need to, in the jargon, internalize the externalities. We all know what that means. So let's all call for a cost of carbon that's sufficiently material to motivate capital to be reallocated at the pace and scale that's needed to deal with the climate crisis. We need nothing short of a complete rethink of the international financial architecture to repurpose it so that it can help capital flow from where it is, developed countries, to where it needs to be, developing, so that we all can secure a future that we would wish to retire into, rather than one where there's climate carnage and chaos and potentially, I know this is going to sound hyperbolic, but when you look at how many people would need to migrate due to, say, a 3 degrees world, we're talking about billions of people having to migrate from where they live today. And geopolitically, we're talking about a very, very worrying outlook for global stability and global peace. And I could quite easily see it precipitating a third world war. Given that the financial architecture was designed to stop that happening, I think it's important that we rethink it now that we know that its current design is going to lead to business as usual climate change of around about 3.5 degrees. It's that big.
Wow, some big statements there. Thanks very much, Steve, for your insights. It's really always really refreshing to have a chat with you. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for the invitation, Natalie. It's always a pleasure.